The man who had everything except them. The warm glow of the Crystal Ember restaurant bathed the dining room in golden light, reflecting off polished marble floors and gleaming silverware. A quiet murmur of conversation hummed beneath the soft notes of a live pianist playing in the corner. It was the kind of place where the wealthy and powerful dined without interruption, where privacy was as much a luxury as the filet mignon on their plates. At his usual table, in the farthest corner of the room, Daniel Sterling cut into his perfectly cooked steak, savoring the richness of the meat. He dined alone, as he had every night for the past 7 years, ever since he built Sterling Enterprises from the ground up. His routine was impeccable, as predictable as a fine-tuned machine. Work until 7, dinner at 8, home by 10. No complications, no distractions, no room for mistakes. Success had afforded him the kind of life most men dreamed of: power, wealth, and absolute control. Every decision he made was calculated, every move precise. He had spent his entire life ensuring nothing happened by accident. That's why the sight of 2 small girls standing in front of his table, identical twins, their solemn eyes fixed on him, made his grip tighten around his fork. He blinked. They didn't fidget or look around nervously like children usually did in unfamiliar places. They simply stared at him. And suddenly, he couldn't breathe. "Can I help you?" His voice was calm, measured. The same voice that had closed billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. One of the girls stepped forward slightly. She had dark hair tied back with a satin ribbon, her blue eyes piercing in their intensity. "Hello, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice eerily steady. "We're Emily and Claire." Daniel felt a chill crawl up his spine. The way they said his name, the way they looked at him. He didn't understand why, but something about them sent a shiver through him. Then the second girl spoke. "We're your daughters." The words hit him like a physical blow. His entire world tilted. The restaurant around him blurred. The scent of steak and wine vanished. The low hum of conversation faded into nothing but a sharp ringing in his ears. Daughters. His grip on the knife tightened, his breath coming too fast. This had to be some kind of mistake. A scam. A cruel joke. His voice came out harsher than he intended. "That's impossible." But even as he said it, something deep inside him twisted. Because the moment he truly looked at them, he knew. The shape of their faces, the arch of their brows, the haunting familiarity of their expressions. They were his. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he saw her. The woman he had tried so hard to forget. Evelyn Carter. The only woman who had ever gotten past his walls. The one he let go without looking back. 8 years ago. His stomach clenched as footsteps approached. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. A woman's voice, cool and sharp as a blade, cut through the air. "Believe it, Daniel." And then she dropped something onto the table. A single pristine white envelope. It landed with a soft thud, but it might as well have been a bomb. Daniel lifted his eyes slowly. Evelyn Carter stood before him. But she wasn't the Evelyn he remembered. Gone was the soft, bright-eyed artist he had known all those years ago. This Evelyn was steel. She carried herself with an unshakable confidence, her blue eyes fierce, her chin held high. There was no softness in her expression, no longing, no regret, only cold certainty. And something inside Daniel, something he had buried deep beneath years of control and indifference, began to crack. The letter sat between them, like a silent accusation. His fingers hovered over it, but he couldn't touch it. His throat felt dry, his chest tight. Evelyn watched him for a long moment, then exhaled softly. "This is the truth, Daniel," she said, her voice steady but firm. "And if you think you can walk away from it," her gaze flicked to the twins, then back to him, "you're wrong." Emily and Claire stood like silent sentinels beside their mother, their small hands clenched at their sides. Waiting. Watching. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, without another word, Evelyn turned away. The twins followed without hesitation, walking in perfect synchronization. Daniel's fingers twitched toward the letter. And then, before he could think better of it, he grabbed it. The paper crinkled under his grip. His pulse thundered in his ears. His carefully controlled world, his fortress of logic and order, had just been obliterated. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Sterling was afraid. The letter that changed everything. Daniel Sterling sat frozen in his chair, the weight of the white envelope pressing against his palm, as though it carried the weight of the entire world. Around him, the quiet elegance of the Crystal Ember restaurant remained undisturbed, the soft clinking of silverware and the murmur of hushed conversations continuing as though nothing had happened. But for him, the world had just tilted on its axis, and everything he had carefully built over the last 8 years now teetered on the brink of destruction. He clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the letter, but for several agonizing moments he couldn't bring himself to open it. His mind raced, thoughts colliding like crashing waves, each one more unsettling than the last. The presence of Evelyn Carter, the only woman who had ever mattered, had sent a shock through his system, but it was the sight of those 2 little girls, standing with such quiet confidence, that truly shattered him. They had looked at him not with innocence, not with fear, but with a kind of certainty that made his chest tighten. They knew who they were. And if what they said was true, then that meant he had daughters. Daughters he never knew existed. The idea was so absurd, so impossible, that his first instinct was to dismiss it. But his instincts had never failed him before, and something deep inside him, something more primal than logic or reason, told him that this wasn't a mistake. He had seen it in their faces, in the way they stood, in the intensity of their gazes. He had seen himself in them. His hands were trembling as he finally tore the envelope open, the sharp rip of the paper cutting through the haze of his thoughts. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded with meticulous care. He smoothed it out on the table, his eyes scanning the familiar, precise handwriting of Evelyn Carter. The date at the top made his breath catch. 8 years ago. His heart pounded as he began to read. Dear Daniel, by the time you read this, I don't know if you'll care. Maybe you'll throw this letter away, unread, the way I imagine you throwing away the idea of us all those years ago. Maybe you'll skim it with indifference, the way you used to skim contracts that weren't worth your time. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll finally listen. You have daughters, Emily and Claire. They were born on a cold December night, small and perfect, their tiny hands wrapping around my fingers as if they already knew me, as if they had always known me. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to love someone unconditionally, to give your heart away with no expectation of return. I tried to tell you. I called. I wrote. I left messages. I sent letters, one after another, until my hope wore thin and my hands ached from gripping a pen that never reached you. But no matter how hard I tried, there was only silence. You never answered. I waited, longer than I should have, foolishly hoping that maybe one day you would realize something was missing, that you would look for me, for us. But you never did. And so I made a decision. I chose to raise them without you. Not out of spite, not out of anger, but because they deserved better than a father who wasn't willing to fight for them. I never told them about you, Daniel. Not because I wanted to erase you, but because I wanted them to grow up knowing they were loved, not abandoned. But things have changed now. They are getting older. They ask questions, and I can no longer answer them with silence. So now I leave it to you. If you want them, if you truly want to know them, you will have to prove it. Not with money, not with power, not with the things that come so easily to you, but with time, with presence, with something real. Because if you walk away now, I promise you, this time, I won't let you come back. Evelyn. Daniel's hands trembled as he set the letter down. His throat felt tight, as if something inside him had closed off, making it impossible to breathe. His mind reeled, struggling to process the weight of what he had just read. She had tried to reach him. She had called, she had written, and somehow, he had never known. A deep, gut-wrenching anger began to build in his chest. Who had stopped her? Who had made sure he never saw these messages, these letters? Because if he had known, if he had even gotten the slightest hint that Evelyn was pregnant, he would have dropped everything. He would have gone to her. But he hadn't. Because someone had made sure he never got the chance. His stomach twisted violently as realization set in. His father. There was no doubt in his mind. His father had always been ruthless, a man who valued legacy over love, business over relationships. He had never approved of Evelyn. He had seen her as a distraction, an unnecessary complication in Daniel's rise to success. And he had eliminated her, systematically, coldly, without hesitation. A bitter taste filled Daniel's mouth as he realized the truth. His father had stolen 8 years of his life, 8 years of his daughter's lives. His grip tightened around the letter, the paper crumpling beneath his fingers. His pulse roared in his ears, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. He had always been in control, always had a plan, always knew his next move. But now, he had nothing but regret and a hole in his chest where certainty used to be. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to push back the rage, to focus on what mattered. Evelyn had given him a chance, a single, fragile chance to make this right. He wasn't going to waste it. His jaw tightened as he pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with purpose. He dialed a number. The call was answered on the second ring. Mr. Sterling. The voice on the other end greeted him, professional and crisp. "I need you to do something for me," Daniel said, his voice sharp, his grip like steel around his phone. "Of course, sir. What do you need?" "Find out everything," he ordered. "Every blocked call, every intercepted letter, every deleted message. I want records, bank statements, proof. Everything my father did to make sure I never knew about my daughters." There was a pause on the line, then a hesitant, "Understood. I'll have everything in 24 hours. Daniel ended the call and exhaled, his shoulders tense. Tomorrow, he would have the truth. And after that, he was going to get his daughters back. The truth they stole from him. Daniel Sterling had always prided himself on control. His world was built on calculated decisions, unshakable discipline, and the absolute certainty that he dictated his own fate. But now, sitting in his office at Sterling Tower, with a thick manila folder on his desk, one that contained the truth of everything he had lost, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: powerlessness. The folder sat unopened before him, its presence suffocating. He had spent the last 24 hours waiting for his private investigator to gather every record, every trace of deception, every lie that had been woven to keep Evelyn and his daughters from him. Now the answers were within reach, but his hands refused to move. For a man who had closed billion-dollar deals without hesitation, who had made ruthless decisions that shaped the skyline of New York, hesitating now was foreign to him. He wasn't used to fear, not of this kind. Because this wasn't business. This was personal. And the weight of what he was about to uncover was heavier than any corporate empire he had ever built. Finally, with a sharp inhale, he reached forward and flipped the folder open. The first document was a detailed call log. His eyes scanned the pages, his pulse quickening with each number highlighted in red. Evelyn had called his office over 70 times in the span of 3 months. 70. Each call had been marked as handled or redirected in the notes by his personal assistant at the time, a woman hired by his father. His grip tightened as he read further. There were letters, too. Dozens of them. Some stamped "Return to Sender." Others marked as "Received," but they had never reached his hands. The signatures of his father's legal team were at the bottom of each rejection slip, authorizing that Mr. Sterling does not wish to receive correspondence of a personal nature at this time. His father had silenced her. He flipped to the next section. financial records. His jaw clenched at the sight of large wire transfers, money sent to an account linked to Evelyn. But the transfers were marked declined or returned. Evelyn hadn't taken the money. She had refused to be bought. That revelation sent a wave of something unexpected through him, a strange mix of admiration and guilt. Then came the most damning evidence, a copy of an internal memo from his father's legal team. The words made his stomach churn. Ensure all personal correspondence from Carter is intercepted and discarded. Do not escalate matters. Sterling must remain focused on the Westfield acquisition. A distraction of this nature is unacceptable. Daniel swallowed hard. He barely noticed the way his fingers had curled into fists until his knuckles turned white. It hadn't just been negligence. It had been deliberate. His father had made sure Evelyn never reached him. The room suddenly felt too small. The sleek, modern walls of his office, which had once felt like a throne room, now felt like a prison. Everything he had built, every hour he had sacrificed, had been manipulated without his knowledge. 8 years stolen from him. 8 years where he could have been a father. His father's voice rang in his head, a ghost of the past. The business comes first, Daniel. Legacy over sentiment. If you want to succeed, you must eliminate distractions. At the time, Daniel had thought his father had been referring to trivial relationships, to fleeting infatuations that men in power could not afford to indulge in. But now he understood. His father had been talking about Evelyn, about his own flesh and blood. His hand shook as he closed the folder. His entire body felt wired with tension, rage simmering just beneath the surface. Then, for the first time in years, he did something completely reckless. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had long since deleted but never forgotten. The call rang only once before a cold, familiar voice answered. Daniel. His father's tone was sharp, calculated, a man who never wasted words. Did you think I'd never find out? Daniel's voice was dangerously calm, but the storm brewing beneath it was anything but. There was a pause. His father was silent for a beat too long. And that was all the confirmation Daniel needed. You should have left it alone, the elder Sterling finally said. Daniel let out a sharp, humorless laugh. You stole 8 years of my life, 8 years of my daughter's lives, and you expect me to leave it alone. His father sighed, as if Daniel were nothing more than a petulant child throwing a tantrum. You were on the verge of an empire, Daniel. You had one shot at making Sterling Enterprises a global force, and Evelyn, she was a liability, a distraction. You know as well as I do that emotions, relationships, are weaknesses. Is that what you told yourself? Daniel's voice turned lethal. That eliminating my family was a business move. That keeping my own children from me was a necessary sacrifice. His father didn't answer immediately. You wouldn't have made it to where you are now if you had known, Daniel. You would have chased after her, ruined your focus, and destroyed everything you were meant to accomplish. I made sure that didn't happen. Daniel gritted his teeth, his pulse hammering in his skull. You don't get to decide what I would have done. You don't get to decide my life. His father sighed again, this time with irritation. What's done is done. You have your empire. You should be thanking me. Daniel's blood turned to ice. I should be thanking you, he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. You have power, wealth, respect, the life you always wanted. If that came at the cost of a woman and 2 children who were never meant to be part of this world. Daniel slammed his fist against his desk, rattling the crystal glass of whiskey beside him. If you ever speak about them like that again, I swear to God. Swear to what, Daniel? His father's tone was condescending, patronizing, the same way it had always been. You don't even know them. And from what I understand, they don't know you either. You're too late. They've lived their whole lives without you. Do you really think that's going to change now? Daniel's fingers tightened around his phone. His father's words were meant to sting, to plant doubt in his mind, but he refused to let them. He had lost 8 years, but he wasn't going to lose another moment. "You're wrong," Daniel said, his voice low and deadly. "You took my past, but my future is mine, and I'm going to be in my daughter's lives whether you approve or not." His father let out a dry chuckle. "Good luck with that, son." The call disconnected. Daniel exhaled, his chest heaving with barely contained fury. His father thought he had won. That was his mistake, because Daniel Sterling wasn't walking away. He picked up the letter from Evelyn one more time, rereading her words. "If you want them, you will have to prove it." He would, and he would do whatever it took. The fight for a second chance. Daniel Sterling had always known how to win. His life was a series of calculated moves, each one propelling him further up the ladder of success. He was the kind of man who saw problems as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. But as he sat behind the wheel of his sleek black Mercedes, staring at the brownstone apartment where Evelyn and his daughters lived, he realized this was a battle unlike any other. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a deal he could broker with money and power. This was about trust, and trust wasn't something he could buy. It had to be earned. He took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. For a man who had stood in boardrooms filled with the world's most ruthless businessmen and never faltered, the idea of knocking on this door, of facing the family he never knew he had, sent an unfamiliar tightness through his chest. He wasn't ready, but he had already lost 8 years, and he refused to lose another second. Stepping out of the car, he adjusted his jacket, his heart pounding harder than it ever had before. The air was crisp, the city alive with the distant hum of traffic and the chatter of pedestrians. But as he climbed the worn steps of the brownstone, the world around him faded. With a steadying breath, he knocked. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then finally, the door creaked open. Evelyn stood there. She was dressed casually in jeans and a navy sweater, but she looked just as fierce as she had at the restaurant. Her arms were crossed, her blue eyes cold and unreadable. But Daniel saw the exhaustion beneath the steel, the weight of single parenthood, of sacrifice, of 8 years spent raising daughters alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Evelyn exhaled sharply and shook her head. "I should have known you'd come." Daniel swallowed hard. "I need to see them." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't get to just show up here and demand things, Daniel. That's not how this works." He nodded, forcing himself to listen instead of reacting, instead of letting his frustration take control. "I understand, but I need a chance." Evelyn studied him, her gaze sharp, as if she could see right through him. "A chance to do what?" "Ease your conscience. Fix things so you can sleep better at night." His jaw tightened, but he didn't snap back the way he normally would. He had spent his entire life controlling conversations, turning words into weapons. But this wasn't about winning. This was about earning back what he had lost. "I want to be their father," he said simply. "Not just for a day. Not just out of guilt. I want to know them. I want them to know me." Evelyn's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in her eyes. Hesitation. "You don't know them, Daniel," she said, quieter this time. "You don't know what they like, what they hate, what makes them laugh, or what keeps them up at night. You don't know who they are. And after 8 years, I don't know if they even want to know you." Daniel flinched at the truth in her words. He had imagined this moment 100 times since reading her letter, but the reality was so much harder than he had prepared for. "Then let me find out," he said, his voice rough. "Let me try." Evelyn was silent for a long moment. Then she glanced over her shoulder. Daniel followed her gaze and felt his breath hitch. Emily and Claire were standing at the end of the hallway. They were dressed in matching navy sweatshirts and jeans, their small hands tucked into their sleeves, but it was their eyes that held him still, their deep, thoughtful gazes, so piercingly familiar. His eyes. For a moment, the world stopped. Then Emily, the bolder of the two, stepped forward. "You came," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Daniel's throat tightened. Of course I did. Claire, the quieter twin, studied him with unreadable eyes. Why? It was a question he hadn't fully prepared for. But the answer came easily. Because I should have been here a long time ago. The girls exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations that only twins could have. Then Emily folded her arms. Mom says trust isn't given. It's earned. Daniel nodded. She's right. Claire tilted her head slightly. So how are you gonna earn it? Daniel hesitated, glancing at Evelyn. She was watching him carefully, arms still crossed, waiting to see what he would do next. He could have promised them the world. He could have told them he would buy them anything, take them anywhere, fix everything. But that wasn't what they needed. That wasn't what Evelyn had fought for. So instead, he told them the truth. I don't have an easy answer, he admitted. I don't expect you to trust me overnight. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. For a long, heart-pounding moment, the twins just looked at him. Then Claire stepped back, slipping her hand into her mother's. Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second longer before nodding, almost imperceptibly. Evelyn exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. Fine. One chance, Daniel. That's all you get. A weight lifted off his chest, but he knew this was only the beginning. He wasn't just stepping into their lives. He was stepping into the years he had lost. And he would do whatever it took to make them count. The weight of fatherhood. The air inside Evelyn's brownstone felt heavier than Daniel expected. It wasn't the size of the space. It was warm, lived in, filled with the scent of vanilla, and something faintly floral. But it was the weight of time that pressed against him. 8 years of absence. 8 years where he should have been here, should have been watching these girls grow, should have been their father. Instead, he was a stranger in their home, in their lives. The living room was a stark contrast to his penthouse. Cozy instead of sleek, imperfect instead of pristine. The furniture was mismatched, the bookshelf overflowing with worn paperbacks and school textbooks. On the coffee table sat a half-finished puzzle, the tiny pieces scattered across its surface. It was so simple, so domestic, that it nearly made his chest ache. Evelyn motioned toward the couch. Sit, if you're staying. Daniel nodded, lowering himself onto the worn leather sofa. Emily and Claire didn't sit. Instead, they hovered near the hallway, watching him with an intensity that made his stomach twist. They weren't just looking at him, they were evaluating him. So, Emily finally said, crossing her arms, "What do you actually want?" Daniel exhaled, resting his elbows on his knees. He wouldn't have admitted it to anyone, but he was nervous. He had built billion-dollar empires, navigated cutthroat deals, but nothing had prepared him for this. "I want to know you," he said honestly. "Both of you." Claire tilted her head. Why now? It was a fair question, one that carried years of pain and unspoken accusations. He had no good answer. At least, not one that would erase the damage already done. "Because I should have been here earlier," he admitted. "I didn't know about you. I didn't know you existed." Emily scoffed, exchanging a glance with her sister. "So it's just a coincidence that the second you found out, you decided to care." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "No, but it's not that simple either." Claire spoke next, softer than Emily, but no less firm. "We don't need anything from you. We've been fine without you." Her words were a knife to the gut, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. They had survived without him. But had they thrived? His gaze flickered to Evelyn, who was watching the exchange quietly. There was exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that didn't just come from work or stress, but from years of carrying everything alone. Daniel turned his attention back to his daughters. "I know you don't need me, but I need you." That made them pause. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Emily's face, and Claire's fingers twitched slightly at her sleeves. "You don't even know us," Emily pointed out. Daniel nodded. "Then tell me who you are." Silence stretched between them. Then Claire finally moved, sitting down in the chair across from him. She hesitated, then muttered, "I like to draw." Daniel blinked. "You do?" She nodded, glancing at her mother for confirmation before looking back at him. "I'm in an art program at school." His heart clenched. "I'd love to see some of your work." Claire shrugged, as if trying to appear indifferent, but there was something hesitant in her expression, as if she wanted to believe him, but was afraid to. Emily, on the other hand, was still skeptical. She sat beside her sister, arms still folded. "We don't trust you," she said bluntly. Daniel met her gaze without flinching. "That's fair." Evelyn sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "All right, that's enough for today." Daniel wanted to protest, but he also knew this wasn't something he could force. Earning their trust would take time and patience. Evelyn walked him to the door, the girls trailing behind her, still watching him as though waiting for him to prove them right about him walking away. Instead, he turned back to them before stepping outside. "I'll see you again soon." Emily raised a brow. "And if we say we don't want to see you?" Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Then I'll wait, but I'm not going anywhere." Neither of them responded, but Claire's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't rejection either. Days passed, but their silence remained. Daniel was used to being a man of action. Waiting wasn't something he did. But Evelyn had been clear. Trust wasn't built overnight. So he waited. And then he started small. One afternoon, a package arrived at Evelyn's door. A set of premium sketchbooks and artist pencils for Claire. Nothing extravagant, nothing overwhelming. Just a quiet acknowledgement that he had listened. The next day, another package arrived. A science kit for Emily. A small challenge for her naturally inquisitive mind. No note. No demands. Just small gestures. Evelyn didn't call to thank him. But she didn't return them either. That night, he received a single message. "Claire, thank you." It wasn't much. But to Daniel, it was everything. The breaking point. Days turned into a week. Then two. Then came the call. It was nearly midnight when his phone buzzed. He had just finished a meeting when he glanced at the screen. Evelyn. His stomach dropped. He answered immediately. "Evelyn." Her voice was strained. "It's Claire. She's in the hospital." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What happened?" "A car hit her bike," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. "She's stable, but I'm on my way." He was already moving, grabbing his keys, shoving past stunned employees as he raced toward the hospital. The drive was a blur. All he could see was Claire's quiet gaze, her hesitant smiles, the way she held her sketchbook close to her chest like a shield. And now she was lying in a hospital bed, and he hadn't been there to stop it. By the time he reached the hospital, Evelyn was already pacing outside the emergency room. When she saw him, something in her expression cracked. She didn't fight him when he stepped forward, didn't stop him when he pulled her into a brief, crushing embrace. "She's okay," Evelyn whispered, her voice raw. "But she's scared." Daniel swallowed past the tightness in his throat. "Can I see her?" Evelyn hesitated for only a moment before nodding. As he stepped into the room, his heart nearly shattered. Claire lay in the hospital bed, a bandage wrapped around her forehead, her arm in a sling. She was awake, but pale, her gaze flickering toward the doorway as he entered. For a second, she just stared at him. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You came." Daniel sat beside her, his throat tight. "Of course I did," he said, because nothing could have kept him away. Claire blinked at him, as if trying to process something, before slowly shifting in bed, just enough to reach for his hand. And for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, Daniel felt the smallest sliver of hope. Because maybe, just maybe, he was finally becoming their father. The unbreakable bond. Daniel Sterling had spent his life fixing problems. In business, solutions were simple. an acquisition, a negotiation, a restructuring. But fatherhood wasn't business. There were no contracts to sign, no deals to close, no deadlines to meet. Only time, only presence, only proving over and over again that he was here to stay. As he sat beside Claire's hospital bed, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing, he realized just how much time he had already lost. 8 years, 8 years of birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories, and whispered secrets between sisters. 8 years of moments that had shaped Emily and Claire into who they were, and he had missed every single one of them. And yet, despite all of it, Claire had reached for him. That single action, that simple moment where she had hesitated, then chosen to trust him, even for just a second, was the most profound thing that had ever happened to him. Her small fingers curled slightly against his hand, her grip weak but steady. He squeezed back, careful, gentle. She didn't say anything more, but she didn't pull away either. And that was enough. Evelyn stood near the window, arms crossed, her gaze unreadable. But she was watching them, watching him, with something that almost looked like relief. He didn't dare believe it yet, but he wanted to. The doctor entered, flipping through Claire's chart before nodding. She's doing well. No concussion, just a minor fracture in the wrist and some bruising. She should be able to go home tomorrow. Daniel exhaled, the tension that had been crushing his chest easing slightly. Tomorrow. Claire's voice was groggy, barely above a whisper. I can't go home yet. The doctor smiled. We just want to monitor you overnight. Make sure everything's okay. But you're going to be just fine, sweetheart. Daniel glanced at Evelyn. I'll stay here tonight. Evelyn hesitated. Daniel. I'm staying, he said firmly. I'm not leaving her alone. There was a beat of silence. Then, to his surprise, Evelyn just nodded. All right. Claire's fingers twitched against his hand again, and when he looked down, she was watching him through heavy-lidded eyes. You don't have to. Daniel smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. I want to. And for the first time since he had met his daughters, Claire smiled back. The morning after, Daniel barely slept. He had spent the night sitting beside Claire's bed, watching over her as she drifted in and out of sleep. He had never felt so protective in his life, never experienced this deep, instinctual need to guard something more precious than all the wealth he had accumulated. When morning came, Claire was more alert, though still exhausted. Evelyn arrived with Emily, who entered the room cautiously, her expression carefully blank. Emily's gaze flickered to her sister. Hey, idiot. You scared us. Claire rolled her eyes. I'm fine. Evelyn smoothed a hand over Claire's hair, then turned to Daniel. They're signing her discharge papers now. We should be out of here soon. Daniel nodded, but his focus remained on Emily, who was watching him with that same guarded expression she always wore. He didn't expect gratitude, didn't expect some grand moment of acceptance. But he also knew that staying last night had meant something, even if Emily wasn't ready to say it yet. As Claire was wheeled out of the room, Daniel walked beside them, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in a boardroom. The outside world felt sharper, brighter, louder than the hospital, and he was suddenly hyper-aware of every passing car, every movement, every possible danger. This was what fatherhood was. That constant, underlying fear of something happening to them. That constant vigilance. That unshakable love. He had barely known these girls for weeks, and already they had become his entire world. The first step toward family. Back at the brownstone, Claire was set up on the couch with pillows, a blanket, and a tray of snacks. Emily hovered near her, making sure she had everything she needed, while Evelyn moved through the kitchen, making tea. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching the quiet chaos of their home. It still felt foreign to him, this messy, imperfect, deeply real kind of life. But for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He felt like he belonged. Emily finally turned to him, arms crossed. "You're still here." Daniel nodded. "I said I would be." She studied him for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. "You really don't give up, do you?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Not when it matters." Emily chewed on her lip, then looked at Claire, who was watching their exchange with quiet interest. "Okay," she finally said. "If you want to know us, then you have to earn it." Daniel's chest tightened. "Tell me how." Emily narrowed her eyes. "First, you have to learn how to make mac and cheese." Daniel blinked. "Mac and cheese?" Emily shrugged. "Claire likes it when she's sad, and you almost burned the kitchen down last time." "So?" Claire snickered from the couch. "This is a test, obviously." Daniel chuckled, rolling up his sleeves as he stepped toward the kitchen. "All right, teach me." Emily raised an eyebrow. "You're really going to take cooking lessons from an 8-year-old?" Daniel smirked. "You seem to know more about it than I do." Claire giggled as Emily smirked, clearly enjoying the power shift. Evelyn, who had been quietly watching, shook her head in disbelief before leaning against the counter. "This is going to be interesting." And for the first time, Daniel didn't feel out of place. The unspoken words that said everything. Later that night, when the girls were tucked into bed, Daniel stood in the hallway, watching Evelyn as she adjusted the blankets around Claire. Evelyn glanced at him. "They're warming up to you." Daniel swallowed hard. "Do you think they ever will?" "Fully." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. "I think," she said softly, "you're already on your way." Daniel exhaled, feeling something inside him settle. He wasn't naive. He knew this was just the beginning. But for the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for, and he would spend the rest of his life making sure he never lost it again. The family he almost lost. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. The girls had long since fallen asleep, curled up in their respective beds, their soft breathing the only sign of life beyond the occasional shifting of sheets. The weight of the day, the hospital, the fear, the overwhelming realization that he had almost lost one of them before even truly knowing them, had settled heavily in Daniel's chest. Evelyn stood beside him in the dim hallway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. They had barely spoken since returning from the hospital, not because there wasn't anything to say, but because there was too much to say. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "She's tougher than I thought." Evelyn smiled faintly. "She gets that from you." He turned toward her, surprised. "You think so?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Emily is the one who fights first. Claire is the one who endures. You do both." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "I don't think I've endured anything. Not really." He glanced back at the girls' bedroom doors. "They have. You have." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment before finally exhaling. "You know, for a long time, I hated you." Daniel stiffened, but he didn't interrupt. He deserved to hear this. "I thought you walked away. Thought you knew about them and just decided they weren't worth your time." Her voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. "And the worst part was, I had to make peace with that. I had to tell myself that even if you didn't want them, it didn't matter, because I did." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "I never knew, Evelyn." "I know," she admitted, looking away. "But for 8 years I didn't, and I had to raise them alone. Every scraped knee, every school recital, every night when they were sick, and I had no one to call. I did it alone." She turned back to him then, her blue eyes burning into his. "And now you just get to walk in and be their father." The question wasn't entirely rhetorical. It was a challenge. Daniel swallowed hard. "No, I don't just get to walk in. I know that." He hesitated before continuing. "But I want to be, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn that." Evelyn searched his face, looking for something. Proof, certainty, maybe even redemption. And then she nodded. Then prove it. It wasn't a command. It wasn't an ultimatum. It was an invitation. A chance. One he wouldn't waste. Rebuilding bridges. Over the next few weeks, Daniel learned just how much he didn't know. He learned that Claire's favorite color was green, but only the right shade of green. Not too dark, not too bright, but somewhere in between, like the leaves just before autumn. He learned that she preferred drawing over talking, that her emotions spilled onto paper in ways she couldn't always verbalize. He learned that Emily loved challenges, puzzles, riddles, science kits, anything that required figuring things out. He learned that she was skeptical by nature, always testing him, waiting to see if he would keep showing up. And he did. He showed up for soccer games and parent-teacher meetings, for science projects, and late-night fever emergencies. He learned how to cook basic meals without setting off the smoke alarm, and how to sit through their favorite movies without checking his phone. And slowly, so painfully slow at times, things began to change. At first, it was small. Emily would sit a little closer to him on the couch when they watched a movie. Claire would let him carry her backpack after school without protest. Then, one night, Claire fell asleep on his shoulder. And a week later, Emily absent-mindedly called him Dad. She hadn't even noticed it, hadn't even hesitated. And Daniel had nearly frozen in place, trying to commit that single moment to memory. It wasn't perfect. There were still days where Emily pulled back, where Claire hesitated before speaking, where Evelyn watched him like she was still waiting for him to run. But Daniel had never run from a challenge. And this was the most important one of his life. A different kind of legacy. Months passed. Evelyn stopped flinching when he knocked on the door. Emily and Claire stopped waiting for him to leave. And one night, Daniel sat at his desk in his penthouse, staring at the Sterling Enterprises portfolio, the empire he had spent his entire life building. For the first time, he wondered if any of it even mattered. His father had taught him that business was legacy, that wealth was the most important thing he could pass down. But his father had been wrong. Legacy wasn't about buildings or contracts or financial power. Legacy was two little girls laughing in his kitchen, arguing over who got the last cookie. Legacy was Emily rolling her eyes, but still letting him help her with her science project. Legacy was Claire grabbing his hand in a crowded store, instinctively, without hesitation. Legacy was this family, this love. A new beginning. On a crisp autumn morning, Daniel stood outside Evelyn's brownstone, watching as Emily and Claire raced each other down the sidewalk toward him. "You're late," Emily accused, out of breath. Daniel smirked, glancing at his watch. "I'm 2 minutes early." Claire, giggling, slid her hand into his without hesitation. "Where are we going today?" Daniel glanced at Evelyn, who stood on the porch, watching them with a small, almost reluctant smile. They weren't perfect. There was still work to do, but she wasn't fighting him anymore. He looked back at the girls, squeezing Claire's hand. "Anywhere you want." Emily grinned. "Even the Science Museum." Daniel groaned dramatically. "That place is a nightmare." "Sounds like a yes," Claire teased. Evelyn let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "Go easy on him, girls." Emily nudged his side. "Nah, he can handle it." And maybe she was right. Maybe, for the first time in his life, Daniel Sterling had exactly what he needed. Not an empire, not control, not power, but a family. And this time, he wasn't going to let it go.